Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Catherine Brookman, Associate Director, Knowledge Transfer and Exchange. And on behalf of Dr. Jack Callahan, Director of the Center of Research Expertise for the Prevention of Musculoskeletal Disorders, or CRE-MSD as we are more commonly known, and Public Services Health and Safety Association, who collaborates with us on these webinars, we would like to thank you very much for joining us today for this free webinar. We're grateful to the Ministry of Labor for our funding, which supports the delivery of these webinars, and to our presenters who provide their expertise. This webinar is part of the Client-Patient Handling Community of Practice, and we encourage you to let your colleagues know about these events. The format of this webinar today is as follows. The presentation will be given, after which we will have 10 to 15 minutes for questions. We ask that you type your questions into the chat box, and I will relay these questions to our presenters. Should you have a pressing question that cannot wait until the end of the presentation, please type this into the chat box and we will do our best to address this right away. Should we not be able to get to all questions today, we will provide a question and answer feature along with the other materials from this webinar that will be posted on our website. The recording of this presentation, the presentation slides, and the resources, along with any questions and answers not addressed today, will be available on the CRE-MSD website under our Communities of Practice section in the near future. Immediately following today's presentation, you will receive an evaluation, and we encourage you to complete it to assist us in the future delivery and planning of our webinars. Now, it is my sincere pleasure to introduce to you our two presenters today. Tyson Beach is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education at the University of Toronto, where he also holds an appointment in the Graduate Department of Exercise Sciences. In addition to his teaching and mentoring roles, Tyson directs the research conducted in the Musculoskeletal Biomechanics in Injury Prevention Laboratory. An overarching aim of his research program is to devise tools and techniques to enhance and maintain the capacity of the musculoskeletal system to withstand physical demands of work and sport. Current research projects are focused on the development of sustainable exercise-based performance enhancement and injury prevention strategies for individuals who engage in non-modifiable, unpredictable, and physically demanding activities. Our second and co-presenter is David Frost. David Frost is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education. He completed an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering, health studies, and physical education at Queen's University before completing his master's in sport biomechanics at Edith Cowan University. He completed his doctorate in biomechanics at the University of Waterloo. His research interests include sport, exercise, and occupational biomechanics, musculoskeletal health and injury prevention, movement screen and evaluation, acute and long-term adaptations to exercise, and firefighter wellness and fitness. He is also interested in the scholarship of teaching and learning. He is a researcher in the University of Toronto's Musculoskeletal Biomechanics and Injury Prevention Lab. Now it's my pleasure to send this over to Tyson and David.
Over the past 10 years or so, we've worked with a number of different organizations, but most of the work that we've done is with the fire service. And so to date, we've probably educated specifically about 1,500 firefighters that are working with about 150 different organizations across Canada and the US with regards to this exercise-based approach to MSD prevention. And so what we'd like to do today is give a bit of an overview of the framework that we've used, how we've come to some of the initiatives that have been created, but then provide some specific examples of things that we have done with individual workers that are being used in various organizations across North America with the aim of actually preventing some of these injuries that are taking place. So just to start, some of the work that we've done with regards to this exercise-based, these exercise-based initiatives, when we started off, we really geared it towards the workplace. And so for fire specifically, this was preventing injuries that are being sustained in the job, and this was helping to actually address some of the performance-related issues that they had. But we really realized very quickly that when trying to get a lot of buy-in with regards to the initiatives that were being created, structuring it or framing the messaging related to the job specifically wasn't attracting a lot of the employees that we were working with. And so it wasn't until we really started emphasizing some of the needs and wants that they had off the job that we started to get buy-in. And so even though the initiative itself didn't necessarily change, we found out very early on that the messaging that's being used to guide these initiatives, coming from management, coming from individuals like Tyson and I, we really needed to cater to the needs and the wants of the members. And so we found out, like I said, very early on that we had to try and understand what interests they have beyond the job. If we're going to put some type of initiative together that is going to help some of the prevent some of the injuries that are being sustained. And so it was the workplace, it was some of the recreational stuff they did off the job, but it was also emphasizing quality of life and family at home. And so it wasn't until we really started to address the interests of the individuals that we were trying to cater to that the initiatives that we were putting forth actually started to take hold. And so, like I said, this is something we learned very early on, and now the initiatives that we're creating, it's not just about the details of the exercise in terms of what exercises are actually being done. A large part of it is on the implementation and the messaging that goes along with it. And so I can't stress that enough, and I know Tyson would echo my comments that if you're working in an organization and have a desire to prevent injuries via exercise or otherwise, it's going to be extremely important to address the needs and the wants of everybody involved. So I think that I would even ask everybody on the webinar at the moment, as we're going through this, really ask the question of what's in it for me, for yourself and the organization that you work with. This is just some evidence to support that sentiment. So some work that we did in Toronto with the Toronto Fire Department, we wanted to better understand what the needs and the interests of the members actually were. And so we just did a really brief survey in addition to some of the exercise-based initiatives that we were putting in place. And over half of the members surveyed, and in this example, it was we had about 450 people participate in what we were doing. So about half of them identified injuries as being the most important thing for them, which again echoes the sentiment about creating an injury prevention program. But the other big thing was that we had to emphasize quality of life. And so if we had gone in and the messaging was consistent with improving job performance or reducing injuries on the job, we would have turned off a lot of people. And so again, like I said, the actual details of the initiative don't have to change, but the messaging to support the initiative and the value that the worker is actually seeing needs to be addressed. And in this case, it was quality of life. So if we're going down this road and we're talking about using exercise to actually prevent some of these injuries and improving quality of life, just very basically, I think that we have to make sure that the initiatives we're putting together are based on evidence, and we have to understand how injuries are happening in the first place. So just as a simple example, I have an individual here lifting up a box. The load in the box doesn't change. Really, the biggest difference in these two pictures is the way the individual is lifting. And so we really have to understand, and I know that the people on the webinar at the moment probably have a pretty decent background in injury mechanics, understanding of just different postural factors that will influence risk. So we look at the individual on the left here, bending his knees, but his back is quite rounded. Look at the individual on the right. not really bending his knees, back's a little bit straighter. So dealing with some of the workers that we have in the past, we show these two pictures, and right away, a lot of people think the individual on the right is lifting with a riskier posture. But because we understand injury mechanics and have all the initiatives that we're creating are based on sound evidence, we know that the individual on the right is a little bit safer. And so these are some of the things that we want to make sure our initiatives are geared towards. Some other work that we've done, if we're trying to prevent the injuries that are being sustained in any type of organization, it's very important to understand what injuries are actually being sustained in the first place, both in terms of body part, location, whether it's job duty or activity that was being performed at the time of the injury, if they can be documented. And so we've actually gone one step farther, knowing that movement is a big part of how people get hurt, why people get hurt. We wanted to know over a 5-year span with one of the departments we were working with, over a 5-year span, not only what injuries were being sustained, but what movement patterns were associated with the injuries that were being sustained. And so the knees, low back, and shoulders were the big three, and we've seen that across a number of different organizations. These are the big three injuries that are sustained. But the interesting thing that we found, and I think that we were one of the first groups to kind of take it a step farther and look at the associated movement pattern. When we look at the low back specifically, we found that regardless of job duty, regardless of what the firefighters were actually doing at the time of the injury, 70% of all low back injuries were lifting and squatting related. We found that 81% of knee injuries were lunging or stepping related, and 99% of all shoulder injuries were pushing and pulling related. And so this kind of really spoke to us, and kind of highlighted something very unique, because it said that it was irrespective of job duty. And so this gives us some insight to say, okay, well, maybe we could use exercise or some type of training environment to change the way people lift, or change the way people lunge, change the way people push, to prevent injuries that are being sustained across the board. And so we don't have to go in and train somebody how to perform every single specific job duty that they have. If we can address the general movement pattern, maybe we could actually change their habit, change their behavior, and that would actually protect them across the board, both at work, at home, some of the recreational stuff they were doing. And so this really highlighted the potential value of exercise, because we could potentially use exercise as this means or this vehicle to change and shape the behaviors of the workers that we were working with. And so just to give you an example of that, if in an exercise or training environment we emphasize what we've identified as key features of a particular movement pattern, the idea would be that they emerge and persist in the things that are really important. And so whether that's safety on the job, whether that's performance in some type of recreational activity, whether that's quality of life, whatever that is, whatever the important things are for that worker, we feel that by using exercise and emphasizing some of these key features that we know are important from an injury standpoint, that we can actually change their habits or ingrain these behaviors that we know are a little bit safer. And in the unfortunate situation that we don't do that, and we're maybe a little bit blind to what is important, so whether that's because of a knowledge piece or we just haven't considered the fact that the way we train, the way we exercise actually matters. If we let some of these things that we know are important go, then we shouldn't be surprised that they actually emerge and persist in the things that are really important. So this individual here in a training environment, if he's allowing his knees to collapse immediately, consistently through training, and this is the habit that he ingrains, then this is potentially the habit that is ingrained when it really matters. And so again, we feel that acknowledging some of the things that are very important, using exercise as a means to ingrain the behaviors that we're actually looking for, can be a very viable solution to address some of the injuries that a lot of the injuries that are being sustained in the workplace. So that's just a little bit of a background, and now we wanted to get into some of the specifics of the things that we would use to actually put a program together. And so the question becomes, we have a general idea of how injuries happen, but what information do we need at an organizational level to actually start building a program? So this is something that we've used in the fire service, and obviously would be a little bit different depending on the organization you work with. But it's very important to consider, reflect on a lot of the organizational demands that exist before going in with any type of the development of any type of program. And so just as an example, with the fire service, things like management support, the member interest, the money for equipment, the number of members that you have, the number of workers that you have, the shift schedules they have, all these things are going to influence both what the intervention looks like and how effective it is going to be. And so it's not to say that an organization can't do anything. It's just we need to understand a little bit about the structure before we go in and design what that first step would look like. So obviously you can imagine that if your organization is one that there isn't a lot of money for health and safety or health and wellness, or there's not a whole lot of time for something like this, that would dictate what it would look like. It doesn't mean that it couldn't be implemented. It just means that the first step or the first few steps that would be created would look a little bit different than an organization that had those things in place. And so this is something that we're really trying to work on from an implementation standpoint, because we've seen firsthand that using the same solution for everybody just doesn't work. And so we want to provide a little bit of guidance with the groups that we work with to say, if we can take an inventory of what is important in your organization, then we'll have a little bit better insight to take those first steps. One of the things that we found to be very effective with the fire service is a peer-to-peer model. And so what we've tried to do is empower a select group of individuals that I think then can go off and be ambassadors in their organizations. And we've also found that this, we're able to have much bigger impact and outreach adopting this model. And so I think I mentioned over the past couple of years, we've actually interacted with about 1,500 firefighters and empowered them through with various resources and tools to go back to their organizations, and so they become the ambassadors and the frontline individuals that are actually making an impact, working with their peers. And we found this to be very effective, both from a knowledge translation standpoint, but also a buy-in standpoint. And so I'm not necessarily sure what it would be like in all the different organizations that you work with, but what we found is firefighters are more likely to listen to their peers and engage with their peers than they would be an academic. So this model has been extremely effective for some of the work that we're doing. And so just to give you guys an example, so of some of the things that we're doing to empower these individuals so they can actually work with their peers that, again, try and address the injuries that are being sustained. First thing, from an exercise standpoint, again, if the goal is to design some type of exercise initiative that is going to be used to address the needs, the wants, change the behaviors that the individual is working with, the first thing that we really need to address is this whole idea of assessment. So we have to know where we're starting. And so from a very simplified standpoint, it really is trying to look at the balance between demands and capacity. And demands you can think of as the activities that I either need or want to do. And this is work, this is life, this is play. But it's what are those things that you need or want to do on a daily basis. And our capacity is essentially what we can do now. And so from an exercise standpoint, it's looking at what do we need to do to build your capacity so that you can handle all the demands that you're dealing with, whether it's the things that you need to do on a daily basis because of your job, or it's because of the things that you want to do when you go home. So from an assessment standpoint, this is where we start. And so we need to understand your demands and we need to understand your capacity. And so we've tried to identify a few simple things that can help a worker or management then help their workers or their organization to address some of these things. So from a demand standpoint, like I mentioned, it really is looking at the activities that the worker performs on a daily basis. So it's work, life, play. From an injury standpoint, we also know that we need to consider the movement patterns that are associated with these activities, because these are some of the behaviors and the habits that we will be trying to ingrain. But we also have to understand the loads and the speeds and the durations that are associated. So we have to understand energy systems and those types of things, because those are also going to dictate how people move or how our workers move. And so, from the demand standpoint, it's work, life, play, it's movement, and then it's the fitness type stuff. From a capacity standpoint, we think it's very important to start with the movement pattern piece. And so we've identified 7 key features that we believe to be critical based on evidence. 7 key features that are critical to preventing the injuries that are sustained by most employees, so the low back, the knees, and the shoulders. And so just very simply, and so this is going to be in a handout that I think everybody gets at the end, so you'll have access to what these 7 key features are. But very generally, looking at knee, low back, and shoulder control. From a knee standpoint, biggest thing would be looking to see, is the knee in line with the hip and the foot? From a low back standpoint, it's avoiding flexion extension, and from shoulders, it's keeping them back and down. So these are 3 simple things that we've really highlighted with the workers that we're working with. And over the past few years, I can honestly say that this has probably been the biggest impact, or the one resource that has had the biggest impact on everything that we're doing. It's simple, it's relevant, it's not exercise related necessarily. And so if somebody isn't necessarily interested in exercise, this is a softer approach to get them engaged. These are things that can be integrated into things they're doing at work. This could be stuff that's integrated into things at home. It's also a great way to empower them so they can share some of this information with their peers or their family members. And so we found that this is an extremely effective tool that can get everybody engaged regardless of their interests or experience. So starting with these key features and these movement patterns has been a great tool for us. But we also realize, like I mentioned with the demands part, that if we're considering this movement piece, we also have to consider context. And so how long are you having to perform a particular activity? What types of loads are you using when you're performing your work tasks or your activities of daily living? What types of speeds might be involved? Because all these things are going to influence how you move. So the video here that you see is just an example of some work that we were doing with firefighters, looking at how load or the actual shape of the object influences how they're moving. But the second piece of this is, as you can see, there's 2 fluorescent pieces of orange tape on the back. So we're also using this as an opportunity to educate the group of firefighters as observers of what some of these key features we were talking about look like. And so in this case, we have a line drawn through the shoulders and a line drawn through the hips. And everybody that was observing was given the instruction just to watch the distance between those 2 lines. And so as the individual bends down to lift something up, or as they lift the hose over their head to put it on top of the truck, does the distance between those 2 lines change? And so we were instructing them that we want those 2 lines to stay the same distance apart, regardless of what they're doing. And so this is one of the little tools that we would use in an exercise environment to actually ingrain the behavior that we're looking for, which would be maintaining the same spine curvature throughout the activity. So just to build on that, it's really important when discussing the movement piece to acknowledge the fact that it's a behavior or a habit, meaning that it's context dependent. So when load changes, when the duration changes, we may actually adopt a different behavior. But it also highlights the fact that it could potentially be changed. And so we can change our habits and we can change our behaviors if we can actually recognize what we're looking for in the beginning. But we will need a process to actually identify some of the things that are important. So if we go back to what we're actually trying to accomplish in the design of an exercise program, and we're using somebody's movement patterns to help guide us to say what's important for them, we'll need some type of process or framework to discern what is important. And so just to give you guys an example, we have a couple people here performing an overhead squat. So just arms up above and they're squatting down as low as they can. And so if we look at this, we would probably say the individual on the left is squatting a little bit differently than the individual on the right. But when we look at this, we're trying to use how they squat as a way to identify what they need from an exercise standpoint to make them safer, to make them perform a little bit better. And so years ago, we probably would have looked at the individual on the left and said, that individual lacks mobility or range of motion in perhaps his ankles or his hips or his shoulders, and therefore he can't squat that low. But what we've learned over time is that there are probably 1,000 different reasons why the individual on the left can't or isn't squatting as low as the guy on the right. One of which could be range of motion or mobility in those joints. So it could be his strength, it could be his awareness, it could be his familiarity with the task. There are a lot of different reasons why he might not be squatting as low as the other individual. But that's valuable information for us if we're trying to identify what is specific, his specific needs would be. But if we look at the individual on the right, it's very unlikely that he could squat down that low if he had some type of deficit or limitation in his mobility at his ankle, his hip, or his shoulder. And so we can use our observations of how people are moving to not only rule in some potential problems, but we could rule out some potential problems or potential needs. So the individual on the right, we could probably say with some certainty that he wouldn't need any type of mobility or flexibility intervention because he's able to squat to a certain depth, and to squat to a certain depth probably cannot be done with such and such mobility at the ankle, the hip, or the shoulder. And so we've done some work looking at the validity of those type of ideas, and that is what's shaking out. So we can't say with any certainty that the individual on the left has a mobility problem, but we can say that the individual on the right doesn't. So all that said is when we're doing this assessment to try and understand the needs and the wants of the workers for the purpose of designing an exercise intervention, to keep it really simple, we're trying to categorize people in three different ways, or three different categories of workers. The first worker is the individual that doesn't have any range of motion or mobility needs. So they have the requisite mobility to perform the tasks that are relevant to them, and they have adequate control or coordination. So they move well. And so we can think that this worker number one is equivalent to the individual on the right. And so this individual would not have any mobility needs, so they're demonstrating that based on the way they're moving, that their ankles are good, their hips are good, and their shoulders are good. And they're moving well based on the criteria that we would have. So that's worker number one. Worker number two is the individual that has mobility, so they have the range of motion, but they just haven't been able to express it or show it in the way they move. So this could actually be the individual on the left. So this individual on the left may actually have excellent ankle mobility. They may have excellent hip mobility and shoulder mobility. They just can't express it, perhaps because some type of control issue. And so that could actually be worker number two. And so if we find out that they have the mobility, but they move like was shown, they would get categorized as worker number two. And then the worker number three would be the individual that can't actually move very well, and it's because they lack mobility. And so the individual, again, on the left here, if we actually assessed his ankle mobility, his hip mobility, his shoulder mobility, and found that yes, in fact, he does have a limitation. So it doesn't matter how aware or how coordinated he is. If we're having him try and put himself in a particular position, or if you think about him being in the workplace, trying to lift up a box from the ground or transfer a patient from here to there, it doesn't matter how aware he is. If he doesn't have the mobility, that's going to influence how he is performing or how he is moving. And so this individual, we would definitely have to address the mobility piece before we can improve the way they move. So these are the three categories of people. So with our firefighters, with the organizations we're working with, we really try and start here. And so it's keeping it simple. So based on the assessment, we're looking for, do you fall into category 1, 2, or 3? And so we're going to just kind of walk you guys through a basic framework or process that we have and that we've used, that we're empowering our individuals, our workers with, so they can actually work with their peers. So as a first step, it is putting them through just a very basic, what we call a movement screen. So it's watching the way they move or perform some general tasks. So this could be squatting, this could be lifting, this could be lunging, something relevant to what is done either in the workplace or something that's relevant to the demands that that individual has. So just to give you guys an example, and this is something that you could try later on this afternoon or with some of the workers that you have in your organization. If we are using this movement screen, and our desire is not only to look at the way that you move, but to try and rule out hip and ankle mobility as being an issue. And so this individual here, what we're having him do is perform a body weight squat with the heels down on the ground. And we have a few criteria to say, if you can perform in this way, that implies that you have adequate hip mobility, you have adequate ankle mobility, as you can see here. And then if he can't perform as desired, we would actually raise up his heels. So we remove the ankle constraint to make it a little bit easier on him, and we have him perform again. And so we're looking to see if he can squat. So if we want to rule out hip mobility, just as an example, we're looking to see if his thighs can get to parallel while he maintains neutral spine curvature. So those two lines on his back, you can kind of see with the red lines. We want that distance to stay the same distance apart. And we might see a difference when his heels are up versus heels down. And so in this case, when he squats with his heels down on the ground, he's not quite getting to parallel. And so we couldn't rule out hip mobility, so we would give him another shot at it with the heels raised. And if he can then get past parallel there while maintaining his back, then we would rule out that hip mobility as being an issue. So this is our first step. To try and identify the needs of this individual, going back to what category would he fall into. You guys will also, in the handout that you get, these are some of the recording forms that we're using. So I won't go into any detail with this, but you'll be able to look to see what we have here, and if you can follow up with any questions that you do have in how to use these forms. But these are things that we're giving to the workers that we're working with, both for themselves, but also so they can work with their peers. As a second step for everybody, if we still can't identify which category they belong to after going through the movement screen, like the individual we just showed you, we will actually have them do a range of motion test. And this would be our second attempt to try and rule out any mobility needs that they have from an ankle, hip, or shoulder standpoint. We've come up with a pretty simplified scoring system, so you don't need any fancy equipment. And again, I think you guys will have this in the handout that you get. But just to give you an example, so if, the video here, we're looking at hip mobility. So we've identified a range of 1, 2, 3, or 4. So based on how high the individual can actually lift their leg, this would be giving some insight into what their mobility actually is. And so the same thing for the ankle, we have a scoring system of 1, 2, 3, 4, and same thing for the shoulder. So depending on the joint of interest, there's different tests here that we can actually use. And again, so same scoring form as before, and you'll be able to look at what that entails and how you can use it. The last step that we would use, so again, the fact that context matters. So just the fact that somebody moves really, really well based on the criteria you have when the so-called demands are low. So when there's no speed, there's no load, there's no time, you're just performing for a couple reps. That's one thing. But in most organizations, it's not that simple. And so people are getting hurt when they're lifting heavier loads, or they're lifting for long periods of time. And so we want to make sure that we're providing that context in any type of assessment that we're having our workers perform. And so just to give you guys an example, same individual as before. And so in this case, just the video that you're seeing, it's just a simple clip of an assessment the individual is doing. And what it was a push-up, a squat, a row, followed by a period of rest. Each station was done for 30 seconds. And so the instruction was to just keep moving for 30 seconds so you can't stop. And what we were doing from an observation standpoint is looking at the back, the knees, and the shoulders, like we mentioned before, just to see if his movement patterns actually changed as fatigue set in. And so this is going to be important in the workplace if we're trying to design an exercise-based intervention to address the specific needs of this individual. If in the workplace they're performing for extended periods of time with periodic breaks or not, we want to know how the extended time could actually influence the movement patterns or behaviors that they're exhibiting. And so this provides a lot of great insight to tell us what their capacity is at the moment so we know where we're starting from. And so if we go back to those three categories, the individual might move really well, have lots of range of motion when the demands are very low, but they fall apart the second they have to lift up, a 40-pound box or transfer a patient, or they have to do it multiple times over the course of a shift. And so this is information that we could then use to design something specific for that person. Okay, and so this is, you guys will have this as well. So this is just another example recording form that we would use to keep track of our observations and establish the baseline capacity for the worker. Okay, so just as a reminder, so we have our three workers here. So the worker number one on the far left, we've identified that they can move well, they have the mobility when the demands are low. So for them, it would be about improving their fitness or building their capacity so that they can handle the demands that they have either in their job or the things that they have identified as being important for them at home. The worker number two, this is the individual that has the mobility. So we've identified that they have the requisite range of motion to perform the tasks that are relevant to them, but they couldn't actually perform or express that when they went to move. So we have to improve this individual's control, or we have to teach them how to move a little bit better. And then the worker number three, they have mobility problems. So we've identified based on the assessment that we've taken them through is they have some type of deficit in their ankle, their hip range of motion that's influencing how they lift, how they squat when on the job. And so this is going to be influencing their risk. So before we teach them how to move, we're really going to have to address that mobility problem. And so we can take this information. So from these three categories of workers, we can then take this to the design of some type of exercise-based intervention. And so that's, again, what we're trying to do. Because at the end of the day, this is the whole idea of the assessment is to find out what specifically this individual needs. Because not everybody needs the same thing. And so how we build capacity is going to depend on the worker, going to depend on the organization. But it's going to be really important that we take people through this simplified approach to identify what's going to be important for them. So from a design standpoint, again, we go back to this demands capacity idea. It's, where do you want to go and where are you right now? And so from a design standpoint, it is really trying to balance those out. And so it's what can we do to build your capacity to meet your demands? So where we're coming from is we really want to redefine how we view exercise. So exercise is not only a tool that we can use to improve our fitness, but exercise is a tool that we can use to change our habits or our behaviors. And exercise doesn't have to be done at a gym. Exercise can be done anywhere. Exercise, we can really think about it as physical activity. But from our perspective, initially, it's being a little bit more deliberate about it. So if we look at the individuals on the left versus the individuals on the right, they're performing the same task. But they're performing the same task in a very different way. So the adaptation that they would get from exposure to this task is going to be very different. The habits or the behaviors that they establish based on performing this task are going to be very different. And so when making any type of recommendation for our workers, if we're using this as a vehicle to change their habits, shape their behaviors, prevent injuries from being sustained, we're going to need to be a little bit more deliberate about how we do this. But we also don't want them to view exercise as this big, daunting, scary thing that has to be done in a gym. So it can be very simple, as long as we understand what their interests are and what the behaviors are we're trying to ingrain. So just to give an example, so we go back to our three pieces of mobility, control, and fitness. From a design standpoint, we could put something together to address the needs. So this would be worker number 3, to address the mobility issues that we might find. And so again, if we're looking to build something very simple that can be done anywhere, that can be done in as short a time as 5 minutes a day, this is just a couple examples of what that could look like. So this could be our worker. They could be on a snack break or lunch break, requires no equipment, only takes 5 minutes, but it's actually addressing the specific needs that they have. And so from an ankle standpoint, it could be 4 exercises to address specifically what's done. It's very important if we're trying to improve mobility that it's not done in isolation, so we have to integrate it back into the pattern. So the picture that we have here is just a squat to highlight the fact that we need to integrate any new range of motion that we're giving somebody into an actual pattern that's relevant, because there is evidence to say that if we improve somebody's range of motion, they're not necessarily going to use it. And that's, again, to highlight, it just highlights the fact that movement is a behavior. And so we have to actually teach the individual how to move. And so, again, this could be something that's done on a daily basis, requiring no equipment, very little time, and it doesn't even have to look like exercise. So it's non-threatening to the individual that may be a little intimidated by this big daunting task that is exercise. So for the next part, so just a control standpoint, so if somebody, if the needs and the wants we identified based on the assessment was that they lacked control of the low back, the knees, or the shoulders, and these were relevant to what they do on a daily basis, then we could develop a similar thing, so 5 minute piece done anywhere, no equipment, to address these specific things. But the key piece being that it would have to be deliberate. So they'd have to know, like, specifically what they're trying to do, what the purpose of the activities was. But again, it's to try and make it a little more palatable, so it's not going to the gym, it's not getting sore, it's not beating yourself up. It's addressing the specific needs that you have to address the needs that you have either at work or at home. And then same thing from a fitness standpoint. And so this is, again, providing the context. So if you're in a situation where you have the requisite mobility and you have the awareness and the control, it's looking at the context of your life. So what are the durations, what are the loads, what are the speeds that are relevant to you, and putting something simple together that can make sure that we're addressing the needs that you have. So I know it's a really quick kind of overview of where we are and what we're trying to do. This here also summarizes what we've learned over the past 10 years in working with a lot of different organizations. So the emphasis on all of this has to be on implementation. And so I think that there's a lot of amazing information out there. The research that's being done, we've learned a lot about how injuries happen. We've learned a lot about what we can do from an exercise standpoint, but putting it into practice and actually getting people to buy in and make this sustainable out here in the long term, I think that's the critical piece. And so what we found in our experience is that before we go in and share some of this information, it's going to be absolutely critical to get buy-in from all stakeholders. So we really have to inspire people to get involved. We have to change their attitude towards exercise. And so even if you guys reflected on what your perception of the word exercise is, that's going to influence your likelihood of getting involved. And so if I said yoga, if I said CrossFit, if I said physical activity, if I said running, all these are going to elicit different responses from you. And so you can just imagine that if we have a big organization with a lot of employees and they hear the word exercise, that's going to mean many things to many people. And so I think that from a messaging standpoint and a buy-in standpoint, we have to just be cognizant of the different perceptions that might exist. And we found that emphasizing small steps, emphasizing the work-life play has been an absolute essential piece to launching an initiative like this. So the actual details and structure of the program doesn't have to change, but the messaging and getting the buy-in does. And only after we've got buy-in can then we share some of the information that we know is critical, that we know is based on evidence. But throughout this whole process, we have to, again, acknowledge the different potential learning styles. So whether it's videos or pictures or webinars like this, all that's going to influence how effective we are in implementing something and actually rolling it out. And just to highlight what I mentioned before about what we found to be successful with the fire service, and not to say that this is going to be successful everywhere, but identifying some key people that can be ambassadors or advocates for this, that can then help influence their peers, has been a great success for us as well. And that will then lead into empowering individuals, which will eventually in turn change their behaviors. So if we can give some autonomy, some ownership for what this program is, so it isn't just a top-down initiative, that it is coming up from the bottom, so the employees are actually helping to guide some of what's done, that's proven to be very effective as well. And I think in the long term, if we really are trying to make this sustainable and change the lives of our workers, emphasizing community, creating the culture, and developing a growth mindset are going to be absolutely critical to this whole piece. But in our experience and our opinion, it really starts with the buy-in. And that concludes our presentation.
Thank you very much, Dave and Tyson. The questions are coming in fast and furious, and so I'm going to jump right in to give you an opportunity to respond to as many as you can. Has there been any translation to other more sedentary or small muscle group-based work, i.e. somebody who's an ultrasound technologist?
This is Tyson speaking now. So yeah, there's the approach we're taking is a little less focused on specific body parts. So from a movement-based perspective, you can definitely design the intervention to cover these types of things. So a lot of it comes back to Dave's, the thing he was speaking about understanding kind of what the demands are for people and then what their capacity. So if we have people with unique, and this is, the approach we've implemented here is very much one that can be individualized. So people with, perhaps lower demand work, some of their needs may be to actually build capacity, and that could be, at a gross level or a lot more micro. So there are numerous exercises and tools to do that. So it's definitely applicable. I mean, making the case for exercise is not really a difficult one. The challenge we found is to try to put it into practice.
Another question, thank you, was did you experience any challenges in getting consent from the workers to be assessed for capacity?
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is one thing that we've kind of learned over time. We went in very naive as graduate students trying to kind of get into this space. So the fire service tends to be one area where there's a little more opportunity because there's provisions for exercise on shift and all those types of things, but still, anytime we're doing any type or promoting any type of capacity evaluation, we want to make sure that workers understand and management understands that it's not meant to be punitive or to be able to, prevent people from work. So it's something we've always had to navigate. This is another reason why we like the peer-to-peer model in our particular case, is because we're getting a little bit away from, evaluating people for the purposes of work or being perceived that way. They're really kind of doing this, peer-to-peer to help each other.
Just to build on that as well, I think that confidentiality has been one of the biggest things that we've had to deal with. And so the workers need to have faith that whoever is doing the assessment is going to maintain that confidentiality so the information isn't shared. But it's also, they need to volunteer to participate. And so it isn't something that everybody is mandated to do. And so this is why the approach that we've taken in terms of trying to inspire people to get involved, emphasizing the work-life play, trying to paint exercise as a much softer vehicle to improve the quality of your life. I think that's something that we've kind of come to over time, because initially you do get a lot of resistance. But what we found is that you can change people's mindset and outlook towards this whole idea of assessing your capacity in a very short period of time if they view it as non-threatening. And so this comes back to the messaging that you're using to actually implement the initiative.
Thank you. Lots of questions here. What did management support and buy-in consist of, practically speaking, and have you tried this out with paramedics as well?
So our work with fire, it speaks a lot to the point that Dave raised about ensuring that we understand everyone's kind of pressure points and needs and wants and kind of, what they need to make this happen. So getting buy-in from management, or supervisor kind of groups is to really understand, what this means to them. So, a legitimate concern in the fire service, for example, is that exercise can be a risk factor in some cases because some firefighters, are not necessarily conditioned to do the kind of high intensity work that these popular programs consist of. So, we get a lot of questions about, are people going to get hurt, all those types of things. So that would be perhaps a different concern from a worker standpoint than a manager standpoint. So a lot of this we found, we're in the paramedic service right now. What we're trying to do is to try to really reframe this, and first of all, by how we present it. So, we think of this more as a kind of a daily movement practice, just things that we can do to change our behaviors, kind of keep your joints, kind of lubed and working correctly, work the corner of your joints just to try to, maintain the basic health of the musculoskeletal system. So part of it's messaging, but then also, trying to involve workers. So we have projects going on with paramedics right now where we're doing, focus groups and qualitative research to really try to understand what people's barriers and facilitators are.
And just one thing to add to the, what does support from management look like? Aside from the typical, funding and providing time and resources and all those things, what we've also found is one of the biggest things could just be involvement. And so if the members actually see the management involved in the initiative, so they're also taking a part in the assessments that are done, they're also taking part in the exercise stuff, that goes a really, really long way. And so we delivered a course just about a month ago to a group of firefighters, and their fire chief was actually in the class. And so that was such a big piece to change the culture in that department, because the actual employees felt that, okay, management is seeing this as an important initiative, and so much so that they actually want the knowledge. They want to get in and be involved with us. And so there are your typical things, how management can support it, but it's also their involvement in the actual program.
Great. We have a question here about tolerating more standing at work. Are there exercises to better prepare people, bracing, back strengthening, shoulder posture?
Yeah, there's absolutely a whole bunch of exercises, so it'd be difficult to get into those. But part of this is coming back again to try to help decide on what exercises to use and how you would implement this would be to take people through these kind of basic assessments, because what might bother one person, it could end up being a symptom of a low back discomfort or pain, but that could arise from many different body parts and body positions depending on the task that they're doing. So, there are definitely ergonomic interventions that we want to consider, looking at how we're redesigning workstations and, opportunities to change postures. But from an exercise position, you may have someone who has, tight hip flexors, or they might have someone who has some issues with their ankles that might really dictate how they position their body when they're moving. So I think the key is really to just do these baseline assessments. And, from a practical standpoint, there's a lot of science, we can get into all the little details, but from a practical standpoint, we find a lot of people kind of need the same thing. So, a lot of these jobs that people do, they tend to exhibit similar kind of outcomes. So being able to tweak the intervention to kind of hit the low-hanging fruit is something that is probably a good start.
So a question to follow up on that is, how did you identify if a poor movement was learned, habitual, or due to anatomical abbreviations such as collapsing arches?
That's a really good question that we get a lot. So what we tried to do with our key features idea is to try to we take our knowledge, our fundamental work, and I think a lot of the great groups like the University of Waterloo, where they're doing fundamental work, understanding how low backs work, how shoulders work, how knees work. We try to, transform that complicated information into simple language and simple kind of positions. Now, One of the things we didn't mention was screening. One of the first things that we like to try to do is if anyone experiences pain or any type of really kind of something that's very discomforting, then our recommendation is for them to go try to see, get some kind of real assessment done. So to know what's good or bad is definitely a challenge, but we do think we know basic things about, the key joints at a gross level that we can observe that are probably kind of hitting those. So it's very difficult, in this type of environment, and especially with workers who may not have the education or training to do full-time assessments. But we try to design our assessments to really try to expose things that might triage people into getting some maybe physical therapy work, or at least having a true assessment. But that's a great question, though.
Just to build on that, one more thing too, I think it's important to distinguish between what workers choose to do or habitually do versus what they can physically do. And so again, to kind of touch on what Tyson said, is we structure the assessments, and we didn't necessarily go into this in any detail, but structure the assessments so we can actually distinguish whether a worker habitually does something versus they physically can or can't do something, because there is a big difference. And then what we would do from an intervention standpoint would be dictated based on whether it's just a habit or it's more structural.
And can you restate how you identify if a person has a control issue?
In the particular example that Dave used, I guess we can probably still see it. So if we're looking at the overhead squat case, I'm just going to move us there. So in this particular case, we have a person, we would take them through, and if they're able to exhibit that they have the range of motion capable to perform the activity that we're implementing in any type of the variation. So we design these variations really quite strategically to try to rule things out. So if we go through something like this and we show that, with the arms up, with the arms forward, the heels up, the heels down, we go through that kind of, that decision tree. And at some point, if someone shows that they have the range of motion to be able to hit a certain position, but then they don't in another, it shows us that there's some kind of control issue somewhere in the chain.
So just to build on that, if we take the individual on the left here, if after this, seeing him perform like this, we said, you know what, I don't know if he actually has a control issue or if it's his ankles, his hips, or his shoulders that are limiting how he squats. And this could be a lift or something as well. So we would then go to stage 2 and actually assess his passive mobility. And so if we find that passively he has the adequate ankle, hip, or shoulder mobility, that tells us that he has it, but he can't use it. And so that would then highlight the fact that, okay, there's something to do with his control here, that he can't express the mobility that he has.
And can I just, so that's a great point, thanks, Dave. And I think another issue here is that we probably could have highlighted a bit is that the reason we use a movement screening approach as the entry level into this is because that allows us to start to figure out and dissociate control problems from mobility problems. So everyone's heard of flexibility and range of motion testing, all those types of things. But if you could imagine from a motor control standpoint, just as Dave said, some people, have enough range of motion, but they aren't able to express it. We would never know that if we started just kind of looking at range of motion tests. So this is why we start at this entry point.
Great. So we're at 101, but I'm going to push through with one last question because I think it really helps to summarize the talk today. And that is, do you see potential in delivering daily movement practice in a group-based setting?
In short, 100%. I think that in addition to kind of addressing some of the needs that we've identified through this assessment, it's realizing that the community and the culture of an organization is to me the most important piece to any of this. And so if you can have a group even if it's 5 minutes, if you can have a group do something together for 5 minutes, that's going to do amazing things for your culture. And so yes, they're going to see benefit. Reinforcing some of the good stuff is going to be great for everybody. So even if you have certain things already, doing it in a group environment is going to have so many positives aside from just the physical, that I would strongly encourage it in any single organization.
Can I also, if the question is also getting a bit more at kind of really nuts and bolts about what this looks like, say if you have 50 workers, One thing we've worked on a lot is these ideas of self-assessments as well. So trying to simplify these so every worker could go through this assessment or group of assessments to be able to see what they need. And then we've done this with sporting teams before, is where you would then cluster groups of people who have similar kind of things that they'd like to work on or need to work on together. So it's actually a pretty quick and dirty way, because Dave and I both come a lot from a sport background as well, where we're used to working with teams. And this is one way is you kind of, administer the tools and let people work together, but then they're able to also then kind of cluster, to reinforce things and work in groups. That's just very practical, because that's a common question people think, is that this isn't something that can be individualized and scaled. And we're purposely working on tools so that we can overcome that. And that's something we really do think you can overcome.
Well, thank you very, very much. I'm sure, along with myself, there's many who want to get out there and just check how their squats are doing and do some of that self-assessment. We will definitely be posting any questions we receive that we haven't been able to attend to, and just so that the two of you know, the comments are coming in fast and furious about what an excellent presentation this was. So thank you very, very much. And to all of you for joining us today, we hope to see you again soon.
Great.
Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.